very much.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody, and good afternoon for the time change. Sandy Pinay-Schindler, Nitsikasun, Pipikasis First Nation Ochinia. And I'm just really honored to be here and share a little bit of what we are doing in Cowessess. So just glad to see everyone, glad to see faces. I'll just take a moment to thank the elders for their prayers this morning. I'm just really honored and humbled to be part of this national presentation. So I will just start and just introduce Cowessess First Nation. We are an independent nation. Oh, I'm hearing an echo. I'm not sure what's going on. So we are a large nation. We've got almost 4,300 members across Canada, and we are located in Southeast Treaty 4 territory. 20% of the nation members are on reserve, and we've just got some statistics here on our education levels. We do have 1 chief and 8 council members. I'm sure most of you know or have seen Chief Cadmus nationally, speaking on behalf of our nation. And we've got, a fairly large reserve land base. And we have some 28% of on-reserve members have a high school education and 41 have some post-secondary education. And we have 237 homes on reserve. We certainly could use more. And that's not my presentation, but I'm just, saying that if we have more homes, our on-reserve population would be much higher. And my role within Cowessess, they hired 4 years ago, I started to work for Cowessess. And we have these areas under the purview of education. So our Cowessess Daycare, our Little Steps Head Start, and our Community Educational Center, and our post-secondary education program. And in the education office, we also overlook policy as well as busing and transportation. So it's quite a full portfolio. Throughout my presentation, you will see that I have a lot of photos because I do take a lot of photos. Really proud of where we are today. It was a lot of hard work to get to where we are. We've got some graduates from the SIIT Education Assistant Program. We have our brand new playground for our Little Steps and a photo of our beautiful school located in the valley. So we are in a beautiful setting in the Qu'Appelle Valley. So I oversee all of these areas. I do have supervisors and that are responsible for each department. I think at last count, I was managing 22 budgets, which is about $5.2 million. And my presentation is about reawakening. And, that seems to be the best descriptor of some of the areas and the process itself that we have undergone since 2017. I'll share our community vision. I've outlined a number of the areas, and my presentation just covers a bit of all of those. And so when we talk about language and culture, it's all encapsulated in all of these areas because we don't really see anything as separate because it all kind of fed into the reawakening and decolonization and indigenization of the processes within the community. And we can see our school in the valley there. So I'll just go through some of those areas. Our vision statement is we respect the honor and diversity of our First Nation, and from this strength we'll all walk together to flourish as a united, healthy community for generations to come. And there's our graduation from CCEC last year and some of our students at the Treaty 4 Governance Center in Fort Qu'Appelle. So the reawakening initially started with our languages. We had less than 10 Cree or Saulteaux speakers in 2017. So I applied for a grant, since I'm sure you're all aware that our funding is not sufficient to cover all of the things we'd like to accomplish. So we did receive a grant through I believe it was Canadian Heritage at that time, and then the National Indian Brotherhood. So we had our first ever language camp in July of 2019. We started with a core group of elders who are we knew had heard or had spoken their languages as younger individuals. So we started with that core group of elders, and through a gifted language speaker, the late Darren Okamason, we started our Cree language program in the community. And we held our language camp. So these brave language speakers who had been speaking for less than a year actually hosted and had workshops for the community. And we had about 125 community members join the language camp. So it was a very beautiful, beautiful language camp. It was just a celebration of our language. And I just want to add a note there that it's very expensive to get back our languages. So we've been really fortunate to have had grants in order to facilitate language reawakening. And just a note on Reawake, to this day, we still have our language program continuing all last year through Zoom. All of those 12 core elders knew how to Zoom into their classes. So that was fantastic because they had weekly classes. And I just, I'm so proud of them for embracing technology and joining in every week for language. And we had supper delivered to them the night we had Zoom classes, and they've just been such a beautiful group of language speakers. And so presently we have almost 100 language learners right now. So we've really grown that the language program. Sadly, we are still waiting on a grant proposal. I don't know what's going on, but we haven't heard yet whether we're successful. So we're just hoping that we do have some language funds for this year. The other thing that I wanted to mention was our regional education agreement process. Due to our unique governance and operational structure, Cowessess, because they're independent, we're not affiliated with the tribal council. Although we do access some second level services from the File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council, our governance and operational structures in Cowessess are completely separate. And that is new since I started here 4 years ago. We do not have portfolio holders. Counselors are not responsible for various departments. Our operations, all the directors for all of our departments report to an executive director. Chief and council spend the majority of their time on larger items like the treaty rights, the Mio Pimatsuan Act, which was recently ratified, and that is the act to bring our children and youth in care home to Cowessess. So those are the larger pieces that chief and council concentrate on, and they let the directors, run their departments. That doesn't mean we run wild or anything like that. We do have a lot of checks and balances, but we're basically running our departments without any political interference or any kind of following any kind of pressure. And so what we've done within education is when I arrived, things were not necessarily in a good place. So we did an extensive amount of work with the community. And luckily we were able to do that prior to the pandemic. So we're building our policies and our strategic plan from the community engagements, and we're building upon that. Indigenous Services Canada, our contacts within that organization, I've explained to them our process. I said, we cannot just, we need to get our house in order before we think about a suitable marriage partner, because I know with the REA, they want us to go to a larger structure. We were not ready for that. We just said, we need to get things sorted out. We need to sort out our own vision, what we need in our community, what processes will work for us through indigenization, because we are that is something that we are doing in every department. And then when we get that settled and sorted, then we'll look for a suitable marriage partner if that is what we want. So the RA, and they've been very understanding and have worked with us. And so I'm really thankful for that, because we really need to make sense of it before we go into an REA. And I know there's a deadline on the REA, but we're just saying, Chesqua, we will sort that out and we will get there. So the end goal is to, potentially look at an REA that works for us, but we'll get there in our own time. And they've been pretty understanding about that. So I just want to go to the community engagements, which were a really important part and an important basis for the work that we're doing today. And back in 2019, we were able to hold community engagements where we had over 200 community members from all ages, meet at our hall. We asked them specific questions within certain areas. We had 6 engagement sessions, and we collected all of that data, and we looked for themes within the data to see what commonalities there would be within that. So we put our research skills to work, and the information that we gathered was really important and critical to the work that we're doing today. And I'll just show you kind of an example of how we looked at the data. So we had values. There were 4 areas that we looked at: programs, values, language and culture, and governance. And so we had 4 questions within those 4 areas. So we had 16 questions, and this is just one of the questions. And we just went through and coded all of the responses and looked for commonalities. So that is forming the basis for the Policy and Education Act. We're also writing an education, I call it Education Act in quotations. It's really what is our education model? What is our lifelong learning model? What are we striving for, and what does that look like? So we are also in the process of writing our own Education Act, and that will govern the areas within education. So you can see some of the commonalities, and this, it was critical for us to gather this information. And within all of these processes, we've also looked at, what are some of the things that we need to look at for our young people. We recognize that we are a community that, like most First Nation communities, have a lot of intergenerational trauma. I don't like the word trauma-based. I think that our healing practices for thousands of years have met our needs in terms of resiliency, strength, and building a nation. And so we've concentrated on these 4 areas. Making sure that, we are fostering family belonging, healing those generational gaps, school belonging, engagement of our young people. But also an important piece was identifying, emotion and showing self-regulation and expression for our young people, because that's really critical in a healing journey. We've looked at predictable, so we're building all of these areas into each of our work plans for all the areas. So, and the other piece too was that, the development of strengths and within our community, and having the community involved with our young people, because there seems to be a real separation. And I know that we have very talented and beautiful community members who could be exemplary role models and be part of fostering what it is to be a Cowessess Nation member, and how proud we should be of that. So we've got our Head Start grad there, and there are our core group of language learners. So another important process that we've been going through is updating all of the Cowessess community education policies. When I arrived, I think the last policies were dated 2002, so they are a little old. So we are we're done all of that now. We're actually in the process of engaging the community again, and probably virtually, to review all of that. We have a policy focus group that has vetted the policies. We've got a few policies where we need to engage youth and parents, so we're poised to do that in November. But I included these 4 questions on the screen because those are the questions that Tribal Chief Edmund Bellegarde always mentions. And he says every education system should be able to answer those 4 questions because they're critical questions. And so we've always kept those guiding questions in mind in terms of building that into our strategic planning. I've included a picture of our CCEC or Cowessess First Nation language float every year in Treaty 4 territory. There is a recognition of the treaties during an entire week where there are speakers and elders and workshops and lots of social activities, sadly put on hold due to COVID, but there's a great parade on Saturday where all Indigenous businesses and organizations and schools have a parade down the main street of Fort Qu'Appelle, which is the site of the signing of Treaty 4. So here is our language float. We're a little competitive in Cowessess, so I'll do a humble brag and say we won 2 years in a row, and we've entered a float for 2 years and we won both times. So we're pretty proud of that. Here are our language speakers and some of our students from the school. I've included a few quotes from our policy focus group. We've met once a week all through the pandemic. I think we had one face-to-face meeting, and that was on March 17th, 2020, just before we closed down. And so, kudos to this group of about 8 people that have worked all through the pandemic in reviewing policies and providing feedback for them. So I won't read those to you. You can read those, and it's just really wonderful to have such a dedicated group. Dedicated to making our lifelong learning model the best it can be. And I've included another 2 quotes from our principal, and we were very fortunate to recruit Susan Bowden, who worked for the Office of the Treaty Commissioner for many years in Saskatchewan, and so she has a really strong treaty-based knowledge and skill set. And so she's also a Cowessess member. So she's been writing our policies and doing a fantastic job and really buying into the whole idea that, we need to look at things like, a westernized model in an Education Act. When we look at student policies, we're not into punitive. We have better ways to support young people in our own ways, in our own healing ways, and reclaiming that and teaching that. And I think that's been the biggest challenge, is that we are all colonized to some degree, and reaching back into the practices of our ancestors has been a real learning process for us. And so when we do have a policy, we talk about it quite a bit, and we say, well, what would be the most supportive way? What's the way that young people were supported years ago? We need to get back to that. So learning that and learning how to do that in a good way has also been part of the work. And just shifting our minds to, like, we do have exemplary practices. Those are the practices our ancestors had. That was their way of life. We need to get back to that and meld modern and the ways of our ancestors in a good way, and come up with a model that works for us. I just want to touch upon our governance structure. I've included a photo of our governance structure as it stands now. Lots of things are in development. I know our housing policy is also under development. We've kind of flattened our governance structure in a way, and for education, we've really wanted to have the community involved. So when we talk about you know, a board model. Like I know we have, you can see the word board in there in a few places. We've really been striving to find something that's more of a community model of governance, and you know, without having to call it a board. Like, is it a council? Is it some? So we're, you know, I know when restructuring, some people start with a board and then go to, but we've actually just grown it from the community on up. So we're trusting the process that when we come to looking at, well, how do we want to govern this? How do we include our stakeholders? How do we include parents and grandparents and youth in this model? You know, how can we represent that in a way that is you know, legal and in a way that is good for our community? So we've asked for help along the way. We're not shy. We ask for a lot of help. You know, nobody knows everything, and so we do ask for, you know, helpers, and we've had many people help us through this process. So we are also looking at what kind of a governance model we could develop for our lifelong learning model. And of course, we want to stick to the principle of Neo-Wet'suwet'en, which is good relations at the base of that. And so a lot of it is, I mean, we started this whole process with ceremony, and we are trusting that process for renewal and reawakening, and it's really important for us to do that. I included this slide. There were challenges. It's not all rosy rose gardens in Cowessess. So a lot of this work occurred during the pandemic, and I would say 90% of it has, like the work on the policies, our work with the community language, lots of our work around the Education Act. This has all occurred during the pandemic. We just, you know, had to continue because we could not stop. You know, one of the opportunities for community language, the language program, was we had many members across Canada join in on our Zoom classes, and we expanded to SOTO, which we hadn't done until last year. And so we had, you know, over 100 people join the classes every week. So that was really wonderful to see. We've had a lot of flexibility from our funders, and I don't mean just primarily Indigenous Services Canada. We've had other funders through grants. They're very flexible in terms of how we meet those deliverables. So we're really thankful for that. We are also, you know, quite fortunate to grow from the community upwards. When we talk about community, we want the community involved. And so that's been one of the challenges for sure, because we had a lot of face-to-face engagements planned for all of this work. So we wanted to run everything, you know, through the community. And so that's a challenge, but we've had most of our annual general assemblies for Cowessess continue online. So that's really good for us to hear from the community. And so the other piece too is that we are developing processes. Like, we want to encapsulate what Cowessess wants for their lifelong learning model. The other really great thing is that our structure, you know, our directors meet every 2 weeks, and we do not have silos anymore. Like, I work very closely with the health department, with prevention, with Chief Red Bear Lodge. So we do a lot of work together and bring our strengths to that. The other challenge, of course, is funding. So, you know, sadly, we don't have enough in our core funding model to provide what we want and what we need. So we still do depend upon grants. And as you know, for those of you who have applied for grants, they are a lot of work. And so we have just, you know, that's been taking a lot of our time as well. And the only other challenge that I wanted to add here was the grant funding bodies are behind on communication. So we're still waiting on 2 major grants, and, you know, they told us 30 weeks. That's like 7 months. And, you know, we're in October right now and we're still waiting. We're told we're still in the running, but I haven't heard anything yet. So that's been a real challenge for us, because we're ready to go and we're just waiting on whether we have the funding or not. So those are the challenges and opportunities that we've faced in the last, well, I would say since the pandemic. You know, some of those challenges we've had before, but they've just been amplified through this last year and a half. So really, this is the end of my presentation. I know it was really quick. I was trying to stay on time, but I am open to any questions. But I did add this slide, you know, for participants to think about. You know, what does Indigenous governance look like? Like, what did it look like? And how do we authentically include the voice of all of our stakeholders? And do we have to be a board? Like, can there be a more responsive model? And so those are some of the questions we've been seeking the answers to. What does community governance look like? Because we have daycare, CCEC, post-secondary, transportation. We have all of those areas, and how do we represent that in a good way? And how do we involve everybody in the decisions for our community? So there we go. That is the end of my presentation. I'm open to questions if anyone has any questions. Feels like I talked fast. I'm sorry.
No, you're just right on time, Sandy. You know, you did an awesome job. A lot of good governance happening there from the ground up, taking the people's direction, and really good stuff that you're doing out there in Cowessess. So any questions from the group? Any comments?
Did Lori have a question, Lori Ann?
No, actually, I was just clapping. That's like a clap.
Oh,
thing.
great
Woo,
job.
Yay, she's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, my niece.
Sorry.
What about Veronica? Veronica always has a question.
No, I was, thanks for the information. I'm always trying to figure out different ways of doing things. And as you were speaking, like I'm in the middle of those issues with, my hat right now is with a counselor with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm also a council or a coordinator for 6 communities. And so we're right in the middle of the rebuilding of the nations, bringing the 6 back together and actually bringing in all those pieces across their community, whether it's education, social, health, like justice. And I love the education piece because that's my passion, is the education. So everything that you stated, like, then it makes me think of another question or something else I need to do. Yeah, so I really enjoyed it. And so I did take down some of the names that you had, and I'd like to follow up on some of that information sharing. Miigwech.
Thank you for that, Veronica.
Is there any other questions?
My hand is up here. I think.
Oh, Edward.
But Sandy, great job on the presentation, and I sit with her on the provincial education planning team, and look forward to her expertise, especially when we sit down with the FSIN directors group, because we too are going through reconfiguration, and we want to move towards a traditional approach to nation building, and that's what our Grand Council is doing with the strategic planning. So it's good to hear that at the local level that you've got an approach that is working with your elders and community members. So great job, Sandy.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah.
Well, right now, I really love the question, what does Indigenous governance look like? And right now I'm taking a governance class, and I'm looking at that and looking at the Eurocentric models, and looking at how a circle fits into a square, and looking at the research behind it all. And I was like, sometimes when I'm sitting and discussing with colleagues, I'm like pushing their thinking around Indigenous knowledge and how we fit into their governance structure, or how we are developing our own governance structures and indigenizing them. And I really like your concept there, where you had that circular model, because when I was thinking and when I was trying to formulate something, my thought was student in the middle, circular model with everyone with an interagency approach for the betterment of the community. That was something that I discussed in one of my classes. And yeah, thank you for reaffirming that I'm not in that field. I know exactly where I'm going. So thank you for that.
You're welcome, Vince.
Any other comments, questions? No? So I guess with that, I'll thank you so much, Sandy, for your awesome presentation. If anyone has any follow-up questions, Sandy's contact information, I believe, is in her profile on our website for under the presenters. So you could, you know, get in touch with her or get in touch with one of us, and we can provide you that contact information. So with that being said, I'm going to go on to our next presenters. They're going to be presenting Resiliency, Technology, and Constructivism with Indigenous Education. And we have from Prince Albert Grand Council, Edward Mirasty and Vince Brittain, who are going to be doing a presentation simultaneously, I guess, or consecutively. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Vince and Edward.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Martin, and thank you to the elders that had the opening prayer this morning. Just wanted to, I guess, begin by sharing with you, we are like the plants that in those years were torn up from their fertile soil by the invaders. Planted in different farms, they watered us to look at things, so we grew in their garden. Some dried up and some took and grew. The majority, hardly able to adapt to that cold soil and that way of watering, took only to survive. Some of their roots grew long, like the peppermint, looking for their lost land. Though they made fences to keep us within their vision, our roots grew underground and moved on. They grew until they got to our warm, fertile lands where they could look at that last bloom with all of our beauty. It seems fitting to begin with the analogy shared at the United Nations 2007 conference, which demonstrates the plight of many Indigenous people with personal and historical experiences from colonial policies. For Canada's Indigenous peoples, the historical trauma of Indian residential schools have been resurrected with the findings of unmarked grave sites from former students. Although there are calls upon Canada's Indigenous leaders to find the remains of other students, there are also calls for more action on the part of current federal and provincial governments to commit to the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. When we take a look at the origin, and this was shared in the House of Commons in May 1883 by the Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as the head of the department that the Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influences. And the only way to do this would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thoughts of white men. And that was shared by the Prime Minister of Canada in 1883. Given the grave sites and the findings across Canada, starting with Kamloops, Leeds came out with a letter on July the 8th. And in the letter, they had committed to ensuring that children and youth in classrooms learned the truth about the residential school, the ongoing marginalization of Indigenous peoples, and the other longstanding consequences of colonization. So as we move to the origins, let's take a quick look at the legacy of the residential school.
The goal was to resolve the so-called Indian problem. So in 1883, the Canadian government officially instituted the residential school system. By the 1930s, nearly 75% of Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15 were forced to attend these schools. Unable to return home for months or even years, Indigenous children were often neglected and abused, stripped of their language and culture. Thousands of children died while at residential school. Others went missing, never to be seen again. At least 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were institutionalized over the course of more than 100 years. There are approximately 80,000 living survivors. Some have become leaders in their communities, teachers, counselors, commissioners. For many, the trauma of the mental, physical, and sexual abuse they suffered hasn't faded. The children and grandchildren of survivors have inherited those wounds. They have persisted, manifesting as depression, anxiety, family violence, suicidal thoughts, substance use. This is called intergenerational trauma, and it can take generations to heal. For Indigenous peoples, that healing can involve a return to the culture that was taken from them. For others, it involves formal acknowledgement of their experiences.
There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again.
For Canada, it means confronting the past and working towards reconciliation. Laws and apologies are necessary to help us move forward, but reconciliation also requires true understanding and empathy to create space where healing is possible.
So that gives us some context to the residential schools. And this was a part of a project that I did for a neuroscience class looking at cognition and learning and what impairs that learning process. So the next slides I'm going to share with you now looks at the neuroscience of what has transpired from those experiences. And we see what is known as the reticular activation system. And everything that we hear, what our children see, what they feel, smell, and taste become memory, whether it be long-term or whether it be short-term. When it comes to suppressed experiences, such as the residential school, the impact on the psyche or the soul impacts the awareness of historical trauma in the notion of internalized impression. The patient presents with physical, psychological, epistemic, and cultural violence, and the victim identifies with the perpetrator in a variety of ways. And we know from our experiences what that has done to our communities. The illustration by Trista Kennedy captures the vampires that come from that vampire bite, as described, as I've heard metaphorically. So intergenerational trauma, when those who lived through the original trauma have not had a chance to heal from it, their children and grandchildren may also feel the effects of the trauma. Even though they did not experience it firsthand, survivors often transmit trauma to later generations when they don't recognize it or have the opportunity to engage in a healing process. Or, of course, if the magnitude of their trauma is simply too overwhelming, over time, destructive behaviors and mental states can become normalized, leading to future generations suffering. Their pain might manifest in addictions, mental and physical illness, and destructive behaviors long after the initial trauma took place. So here we see instances of political violence. We see family violence and social pathologies that exist in many of our communities. So the intergenerational trauma is something that mental health workers and what has been proven is that the psychological remnants of trauma can be transmitted in humans. Not surprisingly, the burden of carrying a trauma you didn't experience and may not have even understand can cause intense emotional suffering and feelings of helplessness. It turns out that members of First Nations communities with a parent who attend residential school report higher levels of psychological distress and suicidal thoughts than those without that family history. So the effects on the reticular activation system and the impact that it has on the brain, I've left in this presentation for those that want to take a look further into how RAS has affected those, the soul or the psyche. Now we move towards resiliency. And so what can Canada's education system do better? One of the calls, of course, the TRC's calls to action is that in Canadian schools should teach all students about residential schools, treaties, and the lives of Indigenous peoples. Much of the current state of troubled relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians is attributable to educational institutions and what they have taught or failed to teach over many generations. The report reads, education must remedy the gaps in historical knowledge that perpetuate ignorance and racism. So when we look at resiliency, if trauma can be passed down across generations, so too can resiliency. Intergenerational trauma resiliency breaks the cycle and can be seen through the main resilient Indigenous youth in Canada. The author points to some of the inherent strengths of Indigenous communities, such as connection to the land, to culture, and to traditional ways of knowing, which are essential in healing. Effective programs to address intergenerational trauma draw on the power of resiliency and connecting with Indigenous cultures. So Indigenous knowledge, when we take a look at it, and I just love this photo here, it connects to the land, to culture and traditional ways of knowing. I want to draw your attention, and I'll just share a short read here, but Billy Beardy from Gillam, Manitoba, was honored by his people from Fox Creek First Nations in northern Manitoba for finding two fugitives, Cam McLeod, 18, and Briar Schmigalski, 19. The two teens were wanted for killing people north of British Columbia, 3 people specifically, prompting an extensive search involving the RCMP in July and August of 2019. The Indigenous hunter and self-proclaimed bushman were pivotal in finding the remains of the 2 fugitives. He spotted a raven jump up from a deep ravine along the Nelson River while guiding RCMP officers on his boat. He later said in an interview, "Every bushman knows when you spot a raven, it's eating something." That cultural awareness prompted him to turn the boat around to inspect further. Had Billy not noticed the raven rising from the thick brush, neither the helicopter, trackers, or RCMP would have found them. This is an example of Indigenous knowledge that determines that knowing the land, the animals, and culture play a pivotal role in worldviews. So when I looked around at what schools are doing to indigenize their systems, I looked at a very interesting website that looked at the curriculum for their province and how they infused Indigenous knowledge into curriculum. And I believe one of those presenters is here in this seminar. But what they did is they took teachers from their tribal council, from their, not their tribal council, but their education authority in different disciplines, this one in language arts, and they took the learning outcomes in one column, and then they took on the Nahiawau, the Cree ways of knowing, and asked about the cultural activities that would be symmetrical and could coincide with the learning outcomes. And I thought, now this is a practical way that school systems can take their subjects for language arts, for math, and also for science, and done in a seasonal way and a very practical way of indigenizing knowledge into the curriculum. What is also happening is the institutionalization of universities and colleges. Right now, this book is an excellent resource. I believe I got that from Angela Pinay with a list of what institutions are doing to indigenize. And they use one of the TRC's calls to action number 63 for the co-construction of provincial curriculum, inclusion of Indigenous educators with consultation with local elders to be instruments in the dissemination of Indigenous knowledge. So when we take a look at the analogy of the indigenization project, it can be described as an evolving story of how diverse people can journey forward in a canoe. In Indigenous mythology, stories emphasize our relationship with our environment, our communities, and with each other. To stay on course, we are guided by the stars in the sky, with each star a project principle. Deliver holistically, learn from one another, work together, share strengths, value collaboration, deepen the learning, engage respectfully, and learn to work in discomfort. As we look ahead, we do not forget our past. The canoe holds Indigenous peoples and the key people in post-secondary education whose roles support, lead, and build indigenization. Our combined strengths gives us balance and the ability to steer and paddle in unison as we sit side by side. The paddles are the open resources. As we learn to pull together, we understand that our shared knowledge makes us stronger and makes us one. The perpetual motion and depth of water reflects the evolving process of indigenization. Indigenization in relation and collaboration and involves various levels of transformation, from inclusion and integration to infusion of Indigenous perspectives and approaches in education. So as we learn together, we ask new questions so we can continue our journey with curiosity and optimism, always looking for new stories to share. So that's the indigenization project that is occurring in our universities. This came out of the UBC, University of British Columbia. So what I want to share with you is the now implementing constructivism. And as you see here, learners create their own learning. And in constructivism is not a theory, but rather an epistemology or philosophical explanation about the nature of knowing and learning. And another important point I wanted to share with you is embodied knowledge, often referred to as body memory, are connected to land through the teachings and the stories through which they are transmitted. So I want to share with you what I've shared with my colleagues and some of our partners in the indigenization movement, and that's collecting the stories of our Indigenous elders.
Edward, there's no sound on your video?
Our people were out here living in total freedom.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay. Will the Ermine just open the presentation by talking about the historical policies that subjugated Indigenous peoples, and while they were creating policies to disconnect us from the land and the resources, he talks about now we have to move towards the cinematheling, the sharing of Indigenous knowledge.
That the pure elders, they're the pure spoken and ceremonial elders.
We haven't lost anything. And what people have, everybody has it. I earned my first pipe when I was in Oshkabio, maybe for 16, 17 years. You weren't given these things until you're ready. It all started back when I was young, when I was about 3 years old. My parents were very traditional people that were involved in all the ceremonies. Most of the elders, when I was young, were very good elders, very knowledgeable elders. There were people that were well respected in the community that conduct these ceremonies, medicine elders, the grandmothers. At that time, I think they knew that I was the right person for that knowledge. I can remember we traveled kind of a wagon train, I guess, about 6 families, in wagons, and we'll make that circuit, going around for ceremonies. That's where the teaching got started. At a very early age, I was very curious, these elders, the ceremonies. As I grew older, I started asking the elders the teachings, the meaning of these songs that come with the ceremonies. It's a lifetime learning, but that it's not lost. It's there. We haven't lost anything. We haven't lost anything. We haven't lost anything. We haven't lost anything.
So that's where we get into the sharing of the stories, and part of the research that I undertook as I pursued the doctorate of education was to bring technical answers to discussions on how do we improve our students' learning outcomes. And of course, it became clear to me as I got into this class and looked at cognition and learning and how eroded a lot of our traditional knowledge had been in formal K-12 education. And it wasn't until I got to the ITAP program and learning about what Marie Baptiste talked about with cognitive imperialism in education, where my culture and my language and my ways of knowing had been eroded. And so that's why this project was particularly interesting to me, because now I started to look for a pick away at the lock, as I heard one Indigenous author say. Picking away at the lock allows us as educators, as the theme of this conference speaks to, how do we become champions of change? How do we move forward in the indigenization movement? And that's why it prompted me to focus on constructivism as a way forward. In constructivism, when its very basic roots talks about constructivism highlights the interaction of persons and situations in the acquisition and refinement of skills and knowledge. So one author talks about tribal critical race theory and how American Indian students, how to combine Indigenous notions of culture, knowledge, and power with Western European conceptions in order to actively engage in survivance, self-determination, and tribal autonomy. So some practical ways as that education authority, as I shared in the previous slide, getting the teachers together, getting the local elders together to create that Indigenous Knowledge Committee. And what they did is they took them away for 2 weeks and they refined the curriculum. Also, with the assistance of research, the Indigenous Knowledge Committee will develop localized curriculum using resources and activities developed by these specialized teachers from each school. So this is a tangible way that communities can engage with elders and with parents. And we're not homogenous. We don't fit. Even within the Prince Edward Grand Council, we have different treaties. We have different languages and different cultural contexts. So we need to be able to consult if we are to move to a contextualization of curriculum. Another one that under constructivism in exogenous, that constructivism is exogenous. It posits a strong influence of the external world on knowledge construction, such as experiences, teaching, and exposure to models. So one of the things that I pulled out of one of the research articles was decolonization is about centering our concerns and worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory from our own perspectives and for our own purposes. Smith reveals that Indigenous perspectives and worldviews are paramount in a decolonization project. So just from a very practical sense, getting the IK committee to develop activities and to also implement Indigenous worldviews into the locally developed communities in curriculum. And Asana does lend itself to give us some practical ways in the elder that speaks of how he acquired Indigenous knowledge and methodologies. So some of the things that go on to constructivism and indigenization is sharing the history. And I'll be sharing this Prezi link so that you can kind of look into some of the practical ways, but finding out about the residential schools and their survival, and also speaking to the resiliency. How did we maintain those strong fires that the one keynote speaker was talking about this morning? How do we ignite and reignite that and get that fire stronger? And part of it is telling the truth. And as some of that truth may offend, it may hurt, it may conjure up some memories, but in order to reconcile, as we've heard many elders say, we have to begin with the truth. And so this process does lend itself to having those discussions, which is pretty exciting. So I'm going to now move the presentation to my colleague, Vince Brittain, who has created a sequence of activities, practical activities, as part of the asynchronous learning environment. So go ahead, Vince.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Here we go. So what we have done here with the Grand Council moving forward, and just bouncing off of Mr. Mirasty's presentation there, we did a virtual treaty fair to create awareness within the province, in our federal schools, in our provincial schools. And what we've done is we partnered up with the Office of the Treaty Commissioner and Truth and Reconciliation, and also the Grand Council, and we put on a virtual treaty fair. And we brought in various speakers within the province, and we started off in a good way with the virtual smudge. And then we had opening comments from the OTC, Sask Ministry, PAGC's Grand Chief Hardlot. And then we also moved into really digging into the meat and potatoes of the Truth and Reconciliation, and a brief history of residential schools. And he took a look at students' experiences. He also discussed the importance of reconciliation, the importance of moving forward. And that was out of the main office in Manitoba. Then we also talked a lot about murdered missing Indigenous women, and she has been an activist on many issues and topics related to Indigenous people and marginalized groups since the mid 1970s. And we brought her in, and she did two sessions, and that just opened some people's eyes on topics that are just out there. And we wanted to make sure that when we were doing this virtual treaty fair online, that we wanted to make sure that it touched high school content also. So this kind of spurred some really good conversations within the community also. So then we also brought in, it is Indian residential school survivors and stories of leaving home from northern Saskatchewan, life in residential school, effects of residential on the First Nations, and stories of coming home from residential schools. And we had whole high schools coming in from down south of the part of the province and listening to these speakers, where and the main purpose behind all of this is awareness. We wanted to tell the truth. Now is the time of when we start reawakening, start educating people of our true history of Canada, of actually what happened, because sometimes people turn that blind eye and they're like, really, that really happened? And I'm like, yes, it did. Then we brought in also Wanuskewin virtual tour, and he gave a history of Wanuskewin being a gathering ground for over 600 years. And he talked about language revitalization programs and how the facility has grown into a global center for education. And participants enjoyed a virtual tour of the facility. So during that time also, we had 160 registered, 800 students, and it was over 3 days at the end of September. And we just finished having it here in September. And there was individual, whole classrooms, and whole schools. And that was very, very great. And I just wanted to share some of the things that because we did a Survey Monkey through the OTC, and they sent us all of the information, and that was one of our main partners. And testimonies from Tom and Phyllis were the most impactful. I was able to have a discussion with my students after the Wanuskewin tour about a treaty, what a treaty is, and what we live, and that we live in Treaty 6 territory. And then can see more clearly the divide between the treaties and the Indian Act. And these are our not our provincial schools that were logging on as whole classrooms. I like that it was virtual, it allowed us to join. I appreciate that all of the classrooms could join. I like the selection of sessions. And one person said, it changed my life. I didn't know that these things actually happen here in Canada. Another comment was wanted to learn more about these certain topics that are out there. The facilitators were very knowledgeable and full of very good information. It was a very beneficial for me and my students. And we had, so next year, our platform is going bigger and better, and just to keep on improving it, because what we want to do is we want to educate people about treaty education and the impact of colonialism. Then what we've also done is we also did micro credentials, and we there's some activities in here that we've done. We've done a book creator. So here's some a real good activity that we've done as a land-based, and how we just took some curriculum and just kind of just blanketed it and said, okay, these are the first, because we did have contact with Sask Ministry, and we'd ask them, can we please have a complete document of all of the First Nation outcomes that are in the curriculum? And then from there, we will create material designed for land-based education. So what we've done, I just basically put a book together, and what can you create using this material? And what's being created when you are piecing these together? And this is an activity that you can do with your students out on the land. And just to let you know, I actually used this, and that's where I got my first buck, right, right, actually on that seat and that hole that was there. There's material, there's the material used, the time frame, and the overview for the, if you wanted to make one, there's an activity right there that you can use. Let me go back if I can. Let me go back to my Prezi. sorry. And then in Google Classroom, what we've done is we use the EEE framework, and I'll get into that, but I won't get into this specific one because everybody knows Google Classroom at the moment. This activity in here is a goose chase activity, and what we've done is we've created a lesson, and we worked with Suntep, and we had them go on a goose chase, and we also did a treaty education, one that corresponds with the Google Classroom. But for this activity that I designed was I actually created, PAGC has created language apps, and they're free and they're downloadable, and you can download those apps. And what I've done is going on the land using the Dakota language and going and scoring points using this Goose Chase app, just to engage kids, because right now we're looking at how are we, because people are saying, how are we engaging students? Well, we're engaging them using technology, creating things using various languages. And PAGC has on their website, when I get to that, they have apps that are free and downloadable, and you can create material designed for land-based activities. So let me carry on here. And this iMovie, let me see if I can. I want to show you this. I think this is cool. Let me get you there. Can you guys see my my desktop? I'm playing 2 videos at the moment. So that was one activity that we've created, and that could be easily utilized for a science lesson that you're creating inside your school, and that would be vertebrates and invertebrates, and using the language and bringing technology into that. So there was, and we've created other things that that are in there also. But I'm not going to go to Loom. Everybody knows Loom. So if you're teaching online and you want to put that to the side, you just create a Loom and how-to videos for your schools and just put them online and on your portal. But I'm not going to go into there because I see that I'm kind of running out of time here. And we also did the EEE framework, and we've created a whole entire Prezi on what EEE framework is, but I'm just going to give you a rundown on what it actually is. So it's a use of a tool also must enhance student learning. Enhancement means the student creates content to demonstrate learning. For example, playing a Kahoot game is engagement, but creating a Kahoot game is enhancement. To support enhancement requires pushing students' critical thinking and analysis and evaluation skills. And Kahoot has developed a printable planning template for students to create their own games. And we have all of this, and that could be a whole nother ball of wax that we can get into, but we're not going to get into that right at the moment. Here is what is EEE. The EEE is a practical framework that measures the degree to which the technology in a lesson is helping students meet the learning goals. The framework is based on 3 components: engagement and learning goals, enhancement of learning goals, and extension of learning goals. And I'm just going to briefly touch on that. That's all. And if you want to find the material, here's our website. As I told you before, you go here, and here's all those free apps that you're able to download and create games on revitalizing your language. And all you have to do is go to the App Store and download them. With that being said, Cowessess.
That was an excellent presentation, Edward and Vince. Awesome, a lot of knowledge there, a lot of traditional knowledge, you know, being put forward with technology. Awesome. There was a message in the chat regarding the videos. I know you shared some links for other things. Does that include the videos that Edward had displayed?
Yes, the Prezi presentation, we do have the 4 seasons of reconciliation. We've partnered with them to develop micro-credentials that Vince had spoken about. So there's a whole range of resources there for not only our child welfare portfolio that we also take care of, but education. So there's a lot of resources that are accessible. And the 4 seasons of reconciliation does lend itself to accessing those resources. But we do have them available on our portal through different lesson plans.
Okay, so if they're looking for information, they just go to your portal, and
Yes.
You've already provided a link in the chat, correct?
Yes, Vince can send that link that he just put together with the Prezi, and then that'll take him to QR code. Will take him to the website.
With that, I'll thank both of our speakers again. I'll thank Sandy, Pinay-Schindler, and Edward and Vince. Thank you for your presentations. They were great. And, you know, I look forward to learning more about the technology part of education. I'll be looking at that website there, Edward and Vince. So